Reading 21 is entitled Women Without Class, Chicas, Cholas, Trash, and the Present slash Absence of Class Identity, and is written by Julie Betty. So, one thing that I really like about this reading is that this is a reading where instead of expounding on the concept of intersectionality and explaining the theoretical foundations of intersectionality, like our two earlier readings, this reading is more of just an example of intersectionality in practice. Julie Betty's research reflects an intersectional lens. And so for this reason, I hope that you maybe found it a little bit more engaging. She actually has a book by the same name, Women Without Class. And so this reading opens up with examples, the Wigga example, and the cover of Examiner magazine, which was looking at suburban kids who, embrace hip hop and hip hop culture. And suburban kids was meant largely to refer to white teenagers. And then that recap of an episode of Oprah where it was a discussion of, dressing black versus dressing white. And she provides these examples to make several points. First of all, she provides these examples to note that there is an invisibility of gender, because in both of these examples, the focus is on young men, but also a failure to think class. Because we associate race and class, and she talks about this, she refers to it in terms of it being a race class binary. Oftentimes we racialize classes where the assumption is if someone is middle class, upper middle class, they're white. And if someone is lower, working class or lower class, then they're black. And so in both of these examples, they're not really accounting for the fact, certainly in the dressing black or white example, that really how those young men were dressing was more of a reflection of their class identity more so than race. But this race class binary isn't very surprising, because a concept that often comes up in sociology classes focused on race and race relations is the concept of race class conflation. And I did want to go over that concept in a little bit of additional detail, because I think it would help you to understand Betty's point about the race class binary. So where does this race class conflation, how do we discuss it? How do we talk about it? Well, before the civil rights movement, there were definitely African Americans who were doing well, but they were statistically small in number. They were, and this reflected the fact that there were, of course, limited opportunities for African Americans to go to college, limited opportunities for them to have, white collar professional jobs that paid the type of salaries that we associate with being middle class and upper middle class. After the civil rights movement, certainly a consequence of the civil rights movement was there was a series of civil rights laws, and they sought to make it illegal to discriminate on the basis of race, sex, religion, physical disability, or ethnic origin. And so that opened up some occupational pathways that had previously been closed to African Americans. Similarly, during the 60s and the 70s, we had the most concentrated push in both educational institutions as well as occupations to hire more African Americans through the formation of affirmative action policies. So within about 15, 20 years, the result of this is a concept that is referred to as the two Black Americas concept. African Americans that were able to take advantage of these opportunities in higher education, these opportunities that were opening up in white collar professional jobs, were able to kind of begin to gain a more sizable presence in the middle class sphere in suburbia. Around this same time, in the late 70s, early 80s, African Americans who were not able to take advantage or benefit from this opening up of opportunities. Um, Started to find that their lives actually got worse in the 80s. And part of this has to do with, of course, the spread of drugs in largely poor Black communities, and then the crackdown, on drug users and sellers. The war on drugs that existed in the 80s and the 90s, that sent a lot of African American men as well as some women to jail. Schools which had been integrating, there started to be a pushback against busing and integration, and a lot of schools began to resegregate, exhibiting a pattern of resegregation, as well as by the end of the 80s, from a lot of non minorities, there started to be diminishing support for affirmative action policies, both in the labor market as well as in higher education. So some of these opportunities began to dwindle. And so statistically, when you look at African Americans, there is about 20% that, by all accounts and measures is doing fairly well in terms of um, obtaining higher education, having middle class employment, buying a home. Um, and then there is a fairly significant percentage of the population, closer to 1/3, that is struggling, is at or right below the poverty line, and is experiencing kind of all of those, problems that we associate with being, part of a lower socioeconomic status group. Um, what happens is that class prejudice becomes superimposed on race prejudice or vice versa, meaning um, the worst things that people think about people who are lower class becomes linked to African Americans as a whole, regardless of their class. And then similarly, the stereotypes that people have around African Americans are, rooted in these class stereotypes, become linked with like lower class groups as well. And we call this race class conflation. It's the idea that it becomes entangled, so that when someone has prejudices and stereotypes about African Americans, a lot of times those stereotypes are class stereotypes that become racialized. In this way, if you're thinking about this in terms of experiences and you want to go back to previous concepts that this module has discussed, like McIntosh's concept of privilege or Collins' concept of the matrix of domination, in this way, it becomes difficult for middle class or upper middle class African Americans to always take full advantage or to fully benefit from their class privileges, because they are seen through this racialized class lens where they are assumed to be lower status because they are African American. And so this is the point that, Betty is starting off with, that, in both of these examples, when they're talking about Wigga behavior or dressing Black or dressing white, she's like, they're talking about it in reference to race, but they are failing to think about the role of class, which of course, if someone was using the intersectional lens, that they would. The other issue that she notes is that, of course, gender is invisible here. These examples, as well as a lot of the kind of primary studies of youth that exist in the social sciences, have frequently centered young men. And so that's what makes her study unique. It's an ethnographic study of working class white and Mexican American girls who are in their senior year of high school in California's Central Valley. So that's like the middle part of California. And she talks about the fact that, her title, Women Without Class, is in reference to several things. It is in reference to the fact that, the emphasis is on their working class roots and how these working class roots can limit class mobility because they don't necessarily always have the cultural capital to experience social mobility. Women Without Class, the title is also meant to refer to the fact that oftentimes women are not accounted for in a lot of the traditional sociological books that featured class analysis, as well as the fact that, especially if you look at youth studies, there's a failure to account for women as class subjects. So her primary research question, how gender, color, and ethnicity intersect with and shape class as a lived culture and a subjective identity, is meant to address, is meant to address that lack in the literature, and it's also clearly meant to employ an intersectional lens. So, before we talk a little bit more about her methodology, let's just do a quick refresher on methodology. If you took an intro sociology course, there is that chapter where they discuss methods, but unless you took that course recently, it's highly likely that you have forgotten a lot of this. So, the type of research that she is engaging in is the type of research we refer to as qualitative research. And that's when you are collecting data that cannot be quantified, meaning you can't run like statistical analyses and get like some percentages and other type of statistical data from it. Instead, this is data that exists in usually textual form, and because collecting this data is more time intensive and analyzing this data is more time intensive, usually qualitative research does involve smaller sample sizes, um, which of course, sometimes raises, questions about, okay, well, is your sample representative? Are your results meaningful for anybody outside of your sample, which we refer to as representativeness and generalizability. And so, there are some concerns around generalizability and representativeness when you're doing qualitative research. But the trade-off is that it provides really in-depth knowledge of social life, institutions, and processes. Because unlike quantitative research, which normally is built around closed choice questions on surveys where you have to mark A, B, C, or D. This type of research, it really allows you to have a less superficial understanding of what is going on in with a given sample in a given place, how they feel, how they understand and interpret their lives and their experiences. Specifically, the type of method that she uses is ethnography. And ethnography is a form of field work, and field work is basically when the researcher embeds themselves within a setting and in order to describe or analyze a group or a community. One thing that makes ethnography distinct from other forms of field work is that oftentimes the researcher spends a longer amount of time in a field. Usually, a good ethnography is at least a year. And if you recall from this reading, she is studying these girls for a full school year. And so, when you're doing field work, you go out into the real world, and you don't manipulate situations. These aren't experiments. You basically just, observe and take notes on what is going on in the setting. And then you look for patterns in behavior, and you analyze what is going on, based on what you see. And you can be what's called a participant observer, in which case you are kind of part of the action, you are part of the place to a certain extent, you are taking part in its activities. Or you can be a detached observer or non-participant observer, and this is literally kind of you just kind of observing with very little interaction, with your respondents. So you can tell kind of based on how she describes her relationship with the girls and how she takes part in the activities at the school. She's more of a participant observer than a fully detached observer. So her field site, we know it's a high school. It's in Central Valley, California. The high school is itself, the area itself, she describes in terms of, its racial ethnic makeup. She talks about the fact that the school reflects the town, which is 60% white non-Hispanic and 40% Mexican American. She talks about the social class demographics, um, that it is primarily working class, although there are some middle class people and their children in the area. And she splits the working class into two groups. She talks about working class settle living and working class hard living, with the idea that working class settle living, their jobs are a little bit better, a little bit more stable. They have benefits. Perhaps they even own their own home. And, working class hard living, well, it's kind of right there in the title. Their jobs are in flux. They may move around a lot, experience evictions. There's all kind of like, turmoil and unrest in their family dynamics. The sample that she ultimately is focusing on at the high school is 60 girls. They're half white and half Mexican American, and she talks about some of the things that she learns to know about them: the importance of groups and conflicts, or groups and cliques. The fact that the group and clique membership was oftentimes linked to other social roles. Sometimes it was correlated with class of origin, and class performance at school, but not always. She talked about how some people, would be part of a clique that, you wouldn't expect a middle class girl to be part of, or they would be part of a clique that you wouldn't expect one of the working class hard living girls to be part of. So in some ways, she notes that class performance is sometimes more important than class of origin. um and that, but at the same time, not everyone could engage in successful class performances because materiality and inequality, still matter and exist, right? So if you are working class and you would like to engage in a class performance to try to fit in with the middle class girls, you could work hard at it, but you're probably going to run into just some materiality issues, right? Not having, right type of clothes or the latest accessories, not being able to afford, if they go on trips or vacations or any types of excursions that you may not be able, to keep up with and take part in. So, she does make it clear that while class performance seems to be more important than class of origin, they are still linked. Because there are just limits on resources that can sometimes just detract from having a successful class performance and being able to engage in class passing. So I'm not going to go over, her discussion and observations of certain cliques. I have it here on the slides because I want to emphasize that this is information that you should pay attention to and know. That when she's comparing the preps versus the La Chicas, really be able to discuss, how they're different. And certainly, one thing that she notes is how the La Chicas, engaged in this overt femininity. Their gender displays were more feminized, in terms of how they dress and their makeup. And, Betty is very interested in why overt femininity is sexualized. And, to a certain extent, is it sexualized because of that race class intersection? Because they're more likely to be working class Mexican American girls. Do people perceive them differently when they wear a lot of makeup than they would perceive, girls that had either a different, class or racial identity? The other group is middle class cholas. And, once again, in what way did they share some characteristics with both the preps as well as the La Chicas? I think one interesting point that comes up in this section is her discussion about how, for people of color, because they are racial minorities, they develop these cross class friendships as a form of racial unity. um, um, they acknowledge that their shared racial ethnic identity is meaningful. So even though they don't have social class in common, they still try to have these alliances. But as she notes on page 229, class performance, stood in the way of real racial alliance. But some of these cross class friendships kind of, were maintained because they went all the way back to, like, elementary school years. And the final group she talks about are white trash cholas. Um, and once again, there is a interesting comparison she does where, in the same way that middle class cholas emphasize their Mexicanness as a way of saying, okay, even though we have these class advantages, we're still Mexican American, like the La Chicas. White trash cholas did the opposite. They emphasized that they were not Mexican, because, there is, here in this piece, this race class conflation, not focused on African Americans necessarily, but just on people of color, Mexicans in particular, where the assumption is, oh, you're working class, you're working poor, you're Mexican. And so if you're white and you are in this school in this area and you are lower class, it seemed very important to a lot of her respondents to try to establish that they weren't in fact Mexican, right? Even though they knew that they did not have, a lot in common with the preps. At the same time, they didn't want to be lumped in, with the racial minority group. And so, all of this, of course, just really reflects, some of the other concepts that have come up in this module, right? About why it's important to consider people's experiences through that intersectional lens, as opposed to just saying, like, oh, well, they're all young girls, they have this in common, or saying, like, oh, well, they're all young Mexican American girls, they have this in common, or they're all young working class girls, so they must have this in common. Betty is really trying to make the point that all of these identities matter, all of these identities shape their experiences. So, towards the end of the reading, she concludes by discussing the class futures of her subjects and the role of class in understanding their present day identities and experiences. And she notes that what's interesting is, even though she is highlighting class, for the girls themselves, class was often invisible, and instead, they were much more likely to talk about themselves in reference to their race and gender identities. Um, and school staff, the same way. And so, instead of focusing on the class differences between the middle class and the, working class girls, instead they become articulated these class differences as differences in style. If you're talking about the middle class cholas, whether or not they're acting white, as opposed to just acting middle class, which is what they are. The distinction of good girls versus bad girls, that the preps versus the La Chicas, how, the good girls are seen through this lens where they're not sexualized, because they're not engaging in this overt femininity, and the bad girls are seen through this more sexualized lens. But her point being, once again, what makes overt femininity necessarily bad? And does this have more to do with the race and the social class of the girls who are performing this femininity? And so she ends by just saying, um, it is useful to think of class as performative. But if you are going to think about it as performative, she makes a couple of really important points there. That the performance, cultural performance, is based on cultural capital and habits. and a sense of place. So just meaning that, some people are going to have, more successful or less successful class performances. And, how they choose to perform their class is going to be informed by the larger social environment and social context that they are in. So, what it means to be a working class white or Mexican American girl in Central Valley, California, is different than what it means to be a working class, African American girl in Chicago, or a working class white girl in Appalachia. Those class performances, are going to differ because it's going to be influenced by that sense of place. And her final point is just, thinking about class as a cultural identity, as opposed to a political one, at least with this generation and age group, seems to be more appropriate. And this kind of relates to just in general in America, we do not necessarily don't necessarily have a long history of focusing on class and developing class solidarities and class identities in this country. For a very long time, racial identity has always been the more prominent and dominant identity that has been focused on at the individual level, as well as the interactional and institutional levels. And that might be shifting somewhat, but at least according to Betty at the time that she's writing, um, there doesn't seem to be a lot of class solidarity because class isn't really seen, or perceived as being a significant political identity, not one that they're going to build activism around, unlike what we see with the Mexican American girls and their racial ethnic identity. And so, a couple of questions I encourage you to consider just based on this reading. Betty highlights that class is often overlooked as a source of difference, with a focus instead being on gender differences or racial differences. Do you agree? And why do you think Americans might struggle to articulate class-based identities and/or differences more so than race or gender-based ones? If you were to look back on your own high school experiences, do you think your identity and clique memberships could be understood through an intersectional lens, taking into account your race, social class, and or gender? How did your school's demographics and social context shape your own intersectional identities and the groups and cliques available to you within the school community? Right, so just some questions that, if we were face to face, that maybe I would raise in class. We're not face to face, but so, maybe some questions that you would like to consider on your own.